So, thank you for inviting me. So, it's about the religious and medical vocations in the Belgian military medical service. Just before speaking about the vocations in the Belgian military medical services, I have to describe in a few words the situation of Belgium at the beginning of the 20th century in order to set the scene for my story. At the beginning of the 20th century, Belgium was a prosperous country. It was the third economy in the world. Its financiers supervised big European banks and industrial holdings. Its scientists and its artists were famous all over Europe. It's perhaps a little difficult to imagine today, but Belgium was at a big place in Europe. And also, since 1908, Belgium headed a colonial territory, the Congo, producer of rubber, diamonds, copper, zinc, ivory, and so on. In short, Belgium was a quiet country, only worried about its business. Belgium was also a neutral country, guaranteed by Great Britain, Austria, Russia, France, and Germany. It had never been involved in a conflict. Belgium was a country without military tradition nor military pride. Belgium was born in 1830, so we were a very young nation. And thanks to economic prosperity, we developed an art of national pride. And for the first time was spoken about Belgian nationalism, about Belgian soul, about a shared history and a common destiny. But there was problems. Meanwhile, the French-speaking establishment and domination, the rule of French language in every part of public life, I mean in administration, in education, in justice, in the army, this rule, this French-speaking establishment was questioned by Flemish intellectuals, asking for more rights and an equal position in Belgian society. There were some attempts to change the situation, but not quick enough. And the army certainly was a perfect example of this inequality. It was dominated by the French-speaking establishment. Commands, orders, instructions in the army were given only in French. And if one wanted to climb in the military hierarchy, one had to perfectly know the French language. Yet another characteristic of Belgian society was the importance of Catholic Church. Belgium was a very Catholic country, and certainly in the Flemish part of Belgium. The Roman Catholic Church was omnipresent in public life through its political party, its trade union, its press. Furthermore, the Catholic political party dominated the Belgian parliament and government since 1884. The church was also a part of the French-speaking establishment and opposed resistance to every attempt to divide Belgium. The church stood up for Belgian nationalism, and in her view, patriotism was a Catholic virtue. However, the local Flemish priests understood the claims of Flemish intellectuals and supported them. We shall see it later. The Church in Belgium had also an influence on the practice of medicine. There was an opposition, like in other countries, between scientific progress and religious conceptions. Medical progress was based on scientific research and refuted, of course, the influence of God's will in the outbreak of illness. To take care of body and spirit was no more the task of the Church, since doctors had become more powerful than priors. But, of course, the Church taught that caring for the sick and the poor still was part of her mission. That's why priests, monks, and nuns learned medical notions during their training. There's a lot of congregations that are active in medical care, and the most active are the Little Sisters of the Poor, the Brothers of Charity, and the Sister of the Augustinian Order. Indeed, the running of hospitals and other medical institutions was often only in congregations' hands, in spite of efforts to secularize hospitals and the training of secular nurses. Indeed, under liberal pressure, the law tried to eliminate as much as possible congregations out of civil and military hospitals and psychiatric wards. But it was not always possible, because the running of hospitals was too expensive for the state, which was forced to continue employing religious personnel. However, more and more doctors promoted the creation of secular nursing schools. The very first one was established in 1887 in Brussels. It was followed in 1902 by the foundation of a Flemish nursing school in Antwerp. In 1907, Dr. de Page, who became famous as head of the Ocean Hospital during the war, founded another school in Brussels. This school was directed by an English nurse, Edith Cavell. At the same time, the Belgian Neurology Society organized the first training for specific nursing of psychiatric patients. In return, of course, the congregations too organized nursing training for its members, and one could see the creation of Catholic nursing schools next to secular nursing schools. But during the war, there were still not enough Belgian professional nurses. That's why Belgian authorities called on British nurses to run Belgian military hospitals. As I said before, Belgium was a neutral country, totally unprepared to face a war. And all over Europe, regarding its poor military tradition and its concern to making business first, everybody was quite sure that Belgium never would defend its territory. The German ultimatum of the 2nd of August 1914 asking for free crossing through Belgium was like a thunderbolt in a blue sky. It gave rise to an amazing spirit of resistance and of nationalism. And the Belgian answer was no to the German. And on August the 4th, the first German troops invaded and violated the Belgian territory. The small Belgian army, at the beginning of the war, it had 200,000 men. This army was composed by professional soldiers, conscripts, and 30,000 volunteers. Next to military enlisting, one could find men and women enlisted in charities, in medical services, even in political resistance. Why would citizens participate actively in the struggle led by all these organizations? The major reason was a sense of patriotism, nationalism, a sense of pride, but also an answer to a religious call to make the last sacrifice for a higher ideal. When poor little Belgium was invaded, it was compared to the image of the Christ killed on Easter. Belgium's military resistance and the sacrifice of thousands of innocent citizens was seen as Europe's salvation. Even non-Catholics, for instance the liberals, adopted the Catholic discourse of ultimate sacrifice. Of course, this patriotism and religious feeling faded out during the 4 long years of war. Faced with the fatigue of a war without end, with the military system's inequalities or even injustices, soldiers would only fight to deliver Belgium, their family, their village, and to resume their pre-war life in peace. Now, what was the specific situation of the medical services during the war, and how important was the involvement of volunteers? Indeed, some war volunteers were enlisted in the military medical services. These services, like the Belgian army, were unprepared to face the violences of a modern war. This fact of the Belgian army not being ready was due to a lack of organization and to a wrong approach of the new reality of 20th century warfare. The medical services in the Belgian army were not independent services with their own organization. They depended of the administration services of the army and could take no own decisions. The medical services were considered only as accessory services. For example, if military doctors were officers, they were considered duty officers. They had a distinctive uniform, and for example, there were no sword. They did not have the same prestige or consideration as other officers. They never were called by their rank. One said, for example, Dr. Spaas and never Captain Spaas. And as we see later on, their situation in the army was not an easy one. The other problem was the medical services thought that new weapons would kill the soldiers immediately. Therefore, they thought it was not necessary to organize dressing stations near the front. That's why there, for example, were no regimental doctors at the beginning of the war. Of course, experience learned quickly to change this approach and organize medical services close to the front. And there was another problem. There was not enough doctors, nurses, and stretcher bearers. The army had to call on duty many civil medical people, totally unaware of the reality of war and certainly unaware of the reality of the military system. So we could find side by side military doctors and doctors called on duty, even medical schools students serving as doctors. In August 1914, there were 166 military doctors and 520 civil doctors called on duty, and 172 medical school students. And the two latter certainly had no war experience, because Belgium never took part in a war since its independence. That's why, although they provide their know-how and were recognized specialists in surgery, psychiatry, neurology, orthopedy, often they came into conflict with military authorities. Like in other armies, the doctor task in the army was delicate, because the doctor had to send soldiers as soon as possible back to the front. But at the same time, he had to help and listening to his patients. While doing my research, I paid particular attention to the most difficult part of medicine, psychiatrist evaluating the gravity of an invisible wound. These doctors were quite aware of the stress and the nervous or mental damage caused by violence, fatigue, and disastrous life conditions in the trenches. They were sincerely worried about their patients' health, exactly like they did in their civil private practice. Knowing these doctors were deeply involved in their task, not sparing any effort by doing all they could for their soldiers' patients, as the end of the war approached, they worried about their future. For doctors called on duty and isolated from their civil patients during 4 years, the return would surely be very difficult. They compared their situation, having left their practice to participate on the front lines, with colleagues having remained in occupied Belgium and having kept most of their patients. Army doctors had to recover their patients and to resume their practice. That's the reason why, at the end of the war, before their demobilization in 1919, some doctors asked to be partly discharged of their military duty and to be stationed in their home city to be able to resume their practice. but this demand was not always appreciated by military authorities. Other doctors asked a sort of compensation by being granted a superior rank in the army, but this again was not really appreciated by military authorities. Apart from doctors, other important actors in the medical services were the stretcher bearers. In Belgium, there were priests, seminarians, teachers, or musicians, without real military or even medical training. Due to their situation, they were exempted in peacetime from military service. But when the war broke out, they also were called up. But there was no place for them in the army organization. For example, there were no uniform. They went to war in civil outfit or even in cassock. They received no instructions, no medical equipment, no real duty. So in the first month, they just followed the retreating Belgian army as an ill-assorted band of men, sometimes suspected being spies. Fortunately, some wore a Red Cross armband because they belonged to this neutral and international organization, even when serving in the army. There's a close collaboration between the army and the Red Cross. They had to wait until June 1915 to receive a uniform, as in the same time the entire Belgian army received the new khaki uniform. Just like the doctors, the stretcher bearers had no real position in the army. They couldn't be granted for a superior rank in spite of their education, because they were not considered as active combat troops. For many young, well-educated people, it was hard to endure. The army brought them no prospect. They were called up at the beginning of the war, and they felt that they couldn't do all they wanted to serve their country. They had, and certainly for the seminarians, a great sense of duty, reinforced by their religious vocation. They felt that they had to help and to support their fellow soldiers, as they should do for their parishioners. For these young students in theology, war gave the possibility to test their faith, to become better priests, and they wanted to do the best they could. But the rude reality of trench life was hard for young people, and certainly for young seminarians, and they sought to find moral help by priests established behind the front lines in unoccupied Belgium. Cyril Verschave was one of these priests, welcoming the young students, comforting them, consolidating their faith by organizing Catholic study circles. Furthermore, he tried to talk them into the Flemish movement. We shall see it later. Once the law permitted stretcher bearers to enlist as soldiers in May 1915. Many teachers, but also seminarians, followed the class at the training center for stretcher bearers. War going on, and Belgium unable to dip in its stock in occupied Belgium, the army needed all the possible men to fight. And stretcher bearers were an unused stock to take over from wounded and unable soldiers. All the more that the well-educated stretcher bearers could perhaps make excellent officers. And for the first time, military authorities took into consideration their social level in peacetime society, not appropriate to their position in the army. Authorities justified also this new regulation by hoping that this new position gave to teachers the necessary authority to educate and lead the youth after the war. Stretcher bearers following the training were indeed satisfied to be better considered, as were their French and German colleagues. They felt that they were no more idiot, stupid, or inferior. At the training center, seminarians stayed under the church supervision. They had to attend Mass every morning, and they received extra theology and philosophy class. They learned also how to act as priests with the soldiers. When they were sent back to the front, a total new life began, with more military discipline and more constraint, but the same danger, because the stretcher bearer's task was heavy and tough. Indeed, the stretcher bearers had to evacuate the wounded from the battlefields. A dangerous job. The Red Cross armband not always protecting them from enemy fire. They had to go along the small trenches to conduct them to the dressing station. And perhaps they could give the first aid with their medical kit. But they did also administrative tasks for doctors. And like other soldiers, they participate to working parties to dig or to repair trenches. They had also to care for the dead. They collected their personal belongings and digged graves. Priests, as military chaplains, celebrate funeral services. But the military chaplains did a lot more. They had really a moral, medical, cultural, and social role. Well educated, they helped their comrades in writing their letters. They organized libraries to offer good lecture to their fellow soldiers. They often set up trench newspapers. There were 278 trench newspapers on the Belgian front, some limited to 2 or 3 editions, others published every month during the war. These newspapers were important to keep the link between soldiers coming from the same area, the same village, the same school. They tried to give some few news from occupied Belgium. One must remember, Belgian soldiers were without news from their loved ones, because German authorities forbid any contact between occupied Belgium and Allied countries. Newspapers were also a powerful tool for priests to urge soldiers to be honest, proud, pure, not to go with women, not to drink. It was not an easy task because, were going on, men beginning to despair of the end of it, and morality and piety decreased. For example, since 1916, many soldiers didn't go to Mass no more, nor celebrate Easter. The chaplains also stood up for order, stimulated patriotism and respect for authority, developed sense of sacrifice and courage. With these newspapers, they controlled, or tried to do so, the minds of young people. Wanting to preserve the morality, but also the Flemish culture, both in their opinion treated by Belgium French-speaking culture and the amoral life in the Belgium French-speaking army, some priests were involved in the protest movement of Flemish intellectuals asking for more respect for the Flemish language in the army. They set up a secret organization, the Front Movement, organizing study circles, teaching to read to illiterates, trying to make their comrades aware of the importance of Flemish movement, and publishing political tracts addressed to King Albert. Even if the movement did not have a great number of members, and even if it was prosecuted by military justice, it would have a big influence in the development of the Flemish movement after the war. It is not easy to assess the real influence of priests on soldiers' mind. They were living at the same time apart and in the middle of their fellow soldiers. Were they heard, admired, rejected, considered like heroes or cowards because their life was more comfortable, living often with officers? One could find the different reactions in the soldiers' diaries and letters. It's also difficult to realize the impact of the returning stretcher bearers and priests on the Belgian after-war society. For instance, the young Flemish intellectuals had a great influence on the development of the Flemish movement. They acted in political parties. They were, for example, at the basis of the building of the Iser Tower, honoring the Flemish dead on the front. It became a symbol of Flemish extremist nationalism, a symbol of the birth of Flemish conscience. Wondering about the importance of the returning stretcher bearers in the society after the war is wondering about the influence of veterans on the society. Of course, they fought for their rights, their pensions, the recognition of their sacrifices. But first of all, they try to recover their situations, their jobs, their families. But in Belgium, they never formed a political party, and they never had a great place in political decisions, even when their protest against amnesty for political collaborators, they were not heard. It went the same for the returning teachers. We can't assess their influence on their pupils, where they engage in educational reforms. For Belgium, the First World War was at the same time the peak of Belgian patriotism and the foundation myth of the Flemish movement and the beginning of its radicalization, leading to the country's present federalism. Thank you.